Although Game of Thrones left off with many unresolved plot threads and intentionally unaddressed questions, one of the most interesting twists in the entire series that still remains a bit of a mystery is the resurrection of Jon Snow. Clearly, the sequence of events and Jon's role in them could be drastically different within A Song of Ice and Fire. But in the TV series, at the very least, the actual purpose behind Jon coming back from the dead isn't quite as clear as it should be, considering what a massive moment it really was. Yes, there is a consistent theme in both the books and show about the intention of the gods being mysterious and unexplained. But it's extremely interesting that in contrast to Beric Dondarrion, a fairly minor character who was also resurrected by the Lord of Light, but whose ultimate purpose in the narrative was directly stated by Melisandre, Jon Snow's ultimate purpose was sort of left up in the air at the end of the story. Jon Snow's rebirth is something that was anticipated for a very long time by some fans. And the immediate presumption behind R'hllor's decision to resurrect him is that it was because he was the chosen one who could defeat the army of the dead. While Game of Thrones messed with this particular storyline quite a bit, and invented a Night King where none existed, the writers specifically stated that Arya defeating the White Walkers was a twist that they came up with on their own. But with that said, the notion that Jon will come back to life because he is the lone hero destined to save humanity never quite rang true either. Rhaegar Targaryen may have believed that Jon, or at least one of his children, was born for this gig. But considering that people almost always interpret prophecies incorrectly, it seems safer to assume that Rhaegar was wrong, and his child almost certainly won't be the prince that was promised. And from an even broader perspective, the idea that any one person is fated to save the world doesn't seem to mesh well with the overall themes of A Song of Ice and Fire. Not only does a singular hero seem uncharacteristic of the story, but having one single person who saves the world seems unlikely, no matter who they are. So that really begs the question, why is it that the Lord of Light saw fit to bring Jon Snow back from the dead? The most obvious answer that I think most Game of Thrones fans presumed was that Jon was meant to kill Daenerys and protect the world from her fire and blood wrath. But there are other possibilities. Perhaps Jon was brought back to save the wildlings beyond the wall. Or maybe he was just the man who was meant to raise the alarm about the threat of the White Walkers that was looming over Westeros. However, there is an incredibly dark possible interpretation to Jon's resurrection as well. Ultimately, Jon did many good things and saved many lives over the course of his character arc. But truth be told, there were many people who could have potentially fulfilled Jon's role in these heroic feats. Someone else could have saved the wildlings, someone else could have warned of the coming storm, and someone else could have killed Daenerys Targaryen. But what was the one role in the story of Game of Thrones, and likely the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, that only Jon could play? Again, the easiest presumption is that Jon was brought back to life because he was destined to stop Dany's tyranny and prevent her from conquering the world. But one particular aspect of that notion that I couldn't really wrap my head around was simply, why would the Lord of Light want Daenerys to die? Yes, she slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, and yes, she was a threat to humanity. But the followers of R'hllor certainly don't see her that way. The Red Priests and Priestesses of the book series don't always adhere to the same beliefs or interpret prophecies in the same way. But they all seem to universally agree that fire is awesome, and killing people with fire is even better. Both in the books and in the TV show, there are followers of R'hllor who directly state that Daenerys is some kind of holy savior. And Kinvara very unsubtly states that Daenerys is meant to purify non-believers by the thousands. And it's entirely possible that those who worship the Lord of Light almost universally interpret their religious texts and prophecies incorrectly. They certainly wouldn't be the first to do so. However, if we are to take anything that the followers of R'hllor believe at face value, The one thing that seems to hold true for all of them is that fire and blood equals power, and that sacrificing human lives in fire seems to make R'hllor more magical or more powerful. So with all that in mind, an obvious question seems to be, why in the world would the Lord of Light want Daenerys to die? And why would he bring Jon Snow back to life in order to do it? And the obvious answer seems to be, he wouldn't. Although I'm not entirely convinced that young Griff isn't the real Aegon Targaryen, it seems safe to assume that Daenerys will think he's a fraud. And from that point of view, that means that the only thing that Jon Snow seems to be, that no one else can fulfill the role of, is a Targaryen who Daenerys will believe is a Targaryen, who has a better claim to the Iron Throne than she does. Undoubtedly, the burning of King's Landing will be more complex and nuanced in the books than it was in Game of Thrones. However, Daenerys burning a city to the ground has been foreshadowed quite a bit in A Song of Ice and Fire. And it stands to reason that the discovery of Jon Snow's superior Targaryen claim could be a major contributing factor just as it was in the show. After all, if Daenerys can't take the Iron Throne through a blood rite, she can still take it by right of conquest, just as many kings have done before her. So then, if Jon Snow is the only man in the world who can make Daenerys feel like her claim to the throne is threatened, and that threat leads her to burning an entire city full of people, what could that possibly mean? If Jon Snow was resurrected by a god of fire that seems to be fueled by people dying in flames, doesn't it stand to reason that the purpose of his rebirth wasn't to stop Dany, but was actually to ensure that she would burn King's Landing in the first place? This is certainly the darkest timeline interpretation of Jon's role in the narrative. But it would make some kind of sense in the broader themes of the story as well. The gods of the world of ice and fire are not kind. And after an entire character arc building up towards Jon being some epic hero, it would certainly be a massive subversion of expectations if the mystical chosen one that Rhaegar read about in prophecies and R'hllor decided to resurrect was resurrected specifically because he could trigger the largest fiery blood sacrifice in human history. It seems obvious that Game of Thrones likely meant to imply that Jon's heroic character arc was meant to end when he killed Daenerys. And thus, he was brought back to life for that purpose. However, there is a lot of obvious ambiguity to that notion. And there is nothing within the narrative that contradicts the possibility that the Lord of Light's interest in Jon was driven by his potential to trigger the destruction of King's Landing. And while George R.R. Martin's explanation of why the gods do what they do is likely to be even vaguer than the explanations offered in Game of Thrones, it seems unlikely that A Song of Ice and Fire's narrative will ever say anything to directly contradict this theory either. But ultimately, I just think it makes more sense. Considering what R'hllor's believers seem to think, and considering what R'hllor seems capable of, it just seems more logical that the Lord of Light would have much more of a vested interest in ensuring that hundreds of thousands of people die in a fire, rather than preventing the Queen of Fire and Blood from using her dragons to burn even more people alive. But what do you think? Could the Lord of Light be resurrecting Jon to ensure that the biggest fire sacrifice imaginable actually takes place? Or is it something else? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.